From money to the military. On the last roundtable, we examined the commercialization of space. Now we're looking at the real possibility of space wars. What is the US planning with the creation of a space force, and will others follow? Are we heading for an arms race in space? This is Roundtable with me, David Foster. Our stargazing continues on Roundtable, but before I introduce our guest, we'll start with the thoughts of someone who's been there and perhaps even seen the future. I asked astronaut and former US Air Force Colonel Terry Virts about his comments that America's enemies are already targeting Western assets in space.
Well, a personal story, when I was commander of the space station a few years ago, we had to maneuver my spaceship while I was there to avoid some debris from a Chinese anti-satellite test that had happened way back in 2007, and that debris was still up there. So thankfully, there's not actually a shooting war going on in space, and I hope and pray that there never will be. But that demonstration was an example of what could happen, and that's something very bad. You know, the military obviously depends on space just for communications and for understanding what's going on the battlefield and for knowing the weather. But civilian life depends on space entirely. This program would not be happening if we didn't have assets in space. The world banking system wouldn't happen if the GPS timing signal wasn't there. Everything about modern life depends on space. And I think it's important to make sure that it is a free and safe place to operate for all, civilian and military.
I was interested in looking at an interview between Heather Wilson, Secretary of State for the Air Force, and a Washington Post correspondent, in which she was asked whether she believed that the United States enemies already have weapons in space. And she said yes.
Yeah, I mean, and if you're looking at the modern warfare, it may be easier to target assets in space and have a bigger effect than it is to try to go attack an armored division on the battlefield. It makes a lot more sense for many folks to be able to attack a few assets in space, and that's a much easier thing to happen than to attack, say, the American or the European army on a battlefield.
We had a program about the commercialization of space. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons people want to commercialize it is because there are massive mineral assets out there. They're talking about mining asteroids. Now, this could be another reason to have a space force, couldn't it? To protect international interests, monetary interests in space.
Well, one of the main jobs of the Navy originally, especially several centuries ago, was to stop piracy. Even today, the U.S. Navy and others are trying to stop piracy off the coast of East Africa. So in theory, eventually that could be a use of it. Although, to be honest, that's not happening this year or next year or in this administration. It's going to be pretty far in the future before we start mining asteroids.
And isn't that what we're talking about with creating a space force in its own way? Is taking Earth's problems away from this planet, but just displacing them?
Well, I would argue that nations like America or Europe and other allies, their military is there to do good and to prevent evil. And I think by having a more effective and efficient military, we're going to hopefully, the goal would be to prevent more evil from happening and keep a safer and secure and more free Earth for us.
And we'll be hearing a little bit more from Terry Virts later on in this program. Right now, joining us, I'm pleased to say, via satellite from Baghdad, we have the retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmit, also former Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. At the Roundtable, we welcome once again Frans van der Dunk, Professor of Space Law at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Sarah Cruddas is here, space journalist among many other things, and Mark Hempsell, former president of the British Interplanetary Society. Thank you very much for staying. General Kimmit, thank you for joining us from Baghdad. You say we mustn't dismiss this just because it is an idea that comes from President Trump.
No, that's right, and I think the Colonel laid out quite coherently and articulately all of the issues revolving around this notion of both the weaponization and the militarization of space. I remember a simulation exercise conducted a few years ago when on the first strike, the opposing force being played by some very clever Americans started the exercise by shooting anti-satellite missiles at our assets in space, and that completely stopped the game, and it recognized and demonstrated the vulnerability of our assets in space.
General, when you were part of the military, you were at CENTCOM, Central Command, you know things that you can't divulge to us, but were you aware in a military role of what the United States enemies were doing on the same level?
Well, I think we understood the vulnerabilities of our commercial and our military space assets. And at the same time, we would expect that our enemies would recognize those vulnerabilities and take advantage of them. That was really less the responsibility of our regional commanders and more the command, under the command of our strategic commanders in the United States. But we also understood what would happen to our military operations if, as described by the colonel, there was an attack upon our communications assets, our global positioning assets, and our defensive assets. It would have been very, very difficult to continue operations if those satellites had been knocked out.
Terry Virts, the astronaut, also responded to my question about Heather Wilson, the Air Force Secretary, saying she believed that the United States enemies already have weapons in space. Now, you can comment on that if you like, but my point here is that it's going to take a great deal of calmness to make sure that none of this gets out of control. If the United States has a space force and there are already weaponized countries that have the means to do damage in space, it's going to take some pretty calm heads, and that's not always the case, is it?
Well, I think the fact that we have not seen any type of defensive or offensive operations or even provocations in space means to me that a significant number of cool heads are already operating. However, as you say, some of these issues and some of these situations might spin out of control either through deliberation or miscalculation, and I think that's what we must be most concerned about.
Do you foresee a time when there will be military space stations?
In many ways, there are military space stations now. We call them GPS assets. We call them intelligence collection assets, and in many ways, a significant number of our assets in space do have a military function.
I suppose I'm referring to military personnel, military bases, if you like, in space.
Oh, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves at this point. In many ways, the current capabilities are such that we don't need to put anybody in space. I mean, I think that now is getting into the realm of Buck Rogers and ray guns. I think what we need to do is focus on the immediate threat and the foreseeable future.
Okay, General Kimmit, thank you very much indeed. I know my guests here in the studio have a couple of points they would like to put to you. If you don't mind sitting there for a few minutes, we will come back to you. The satellite delay makes it rather difficult to sort of go backwards and forwards all of the time. But your reactions, first of all, to what General Kimmit has said. Frans?
No, I basically agree, and I think there's even one more point to be made. It's probably a little bit, I'm going out on a limb as a lawyer here because I'm not a scientist, but we should all realize that if you destroy something physically in outer space, you might as well hit yourself as well. I mean, debris doesn't discriminate. So the fact that the Chinese blew up their own satellite 3 years ago, or whatever it was longer, it was 10 years ago, or whatever it was, doesn't mean that their own satellites are shielded from that. So apart from the points that the General made, there is at least a bit of a break on creating too much havoc physically in space, and even the Chinese realized that probably they shouldn't do this again. At the same time, and as a lawyer I have to say that, this is all basically part of the current legal situation, right? There is no prohibition on weaponization of outer space. Part of it is because it's so difficult to define a weapon in that context. Everything can be used as a weapon against another satellite or another space operation.
I thought there was under the Outer Space Treaty, but does it only refer to weapons of mass destruction?
And then only to stationing them, because neither the Soviet Union nor the United States at the time would have accepted a treaty which prohibited the use of ICBMs, which would of course
intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Missiles. The only thing which is prohibited is stationing military bases on the moon or celestial bodies. So the legal regime there is much tighter, but putting them in outer space, And of course, for a number of political reasons, which the General pointed out, it's not going to happen anytime soon, and that's probably a good thing, but there's no strict prohibition to that.
Sarah, say what you have to say. I mean, ask General Kimmit a question. You're a journalist as well.
No, I completely agree with all the points which have come through. I think you've got to remember, you look back at the space shuttle that was flying for 30 years. That came with the intention of launching military assets, and you had space shuttle astronauts who were performing tasks for the US military on missions which were quite secretive. I think in order to have peace in space, you need to have a military presence there. That is going to continue. So I think it is important to remember that this is something which is going to happen. It's all part of just extending our presence out from being Earth-based to extending into space.
Mark, I'll come back to, okay, and then I'll go to General Kimmit again.
I actually sort of try and make the point that this is not a big revolutionary change. This is much more business as usual. The United States Air Force's Space Command, which will form the basis of this new Space Force, it is the new Space Force, is the largest space budget in the world. It is, most of it is classified, but good estimates put it in the mid-20s of billions. It's bigger than NASA's. It does a huge range of functions in support of the military, and most of what the new Space Command will do is exactly what the old US Air Force Space Command. It is just taking the US Air Force's Space Command and making it into a separate branch, just as the Air Force was taken from the Army after the Second World War. So it's not like all of a sudden, and this has been touted in previous presidencies.
No, you're absolutely right.
He's not said, quick, get the Space Marines up and running. He's just saying, it's ultimately, very boring, it's probably administratively better to put this 20, whatever it is, billion budget directly reporting to the Pentagon rather than through the Air Force.
So moving pieces around to make things more efficient.
Yeah.
Right. But by extension...
Sorry, and the other point I must make is, I can't tell you the details here, but way back even in the 1980s, I know satellites that were to be military assets are armoured to a degree.
Do you want to talk? Ask the General about this.
The General will probably, hopefully, confirm me that for way back in the 1980s, we made our satellites assuming they were going to be attacked by lasers or EMP or these sort of electromagnetic pulses. So you knock the satellite. You don't have to totally destroy it. If you laser it,
blind it.
Yeah, you can blind it. You can knock out its electronics. And the satellites that are military are armoured against this and have been since the 1980s.
General Kimmit, your opinion sought on this point.
Well, I agree with your last commenter. I mean, if you take a look at Reagan's Star Wars proposals, many of these same issues were brought to the fore. I also agree completely with this notion that there's really not a lot of new proposals here. I think the comparison to breaking off the Air Force from the U.S. Army and now breaking...
Okay, we've got a bit of a problem with the
See,
satellite.
Space for you. This is why we need more space technology.
It's
Is
not
somebody willfully interfering with this? Is another question.
Bang, somebody's gone. Okay,
I
think Mark Kimmit is smiling. So do continue, General Kimmit. You're saying it's not new, it's a reorganization, but let me put this point to you. By extension, everything that's not new but happening starts small and then it grows bigger. So the idea, perhaps you were talking about Reagan's Star Wars program, is not beyond the realms of possibility, is it, within the next 20, 30 years? Without the realms, I beg your pardon.
I don't think so at all. The purpose behind the Star Wars program was a concern that the capabilities of the Soviet Union were such that they might be able to shoot missiles in a manner that would give far less advanced warning. And the brilliant pebbles, the laser techniques, these were all discovered, these were all developed, but in many ways, as your guest said, there's really not a lot of new here, either in terms of technology or in terms of administration.
But we have the possibility here of a space race, whether it be China, Russia, if North Korea doesn't come on side, it could be North Korea, it could be anybody, competing with the United States and accelerating it to a point where they want dominance of the United States. How is that to be avoided?
Well, they're doing that now. Well, it's not avoided, and it's not going to be avoided. In fact, it's been going on for some time. I think the publicity surrounding the announcements made by President Trump, and candidly, the caricature that's been presented of Mr. Trump's proposal, President Trump's proposal, is really the only reason this is showing up in the media. There is no new here.
At the table, everybody? Mark, you're nodding. You've already said that it's not new, but what about the possibilities for the future?
The escalation thing does worry me a little. The anti-satellite thing started with the Russians having a really crude, difficult, expensive system. And what happened is the Americans responded with basically a missile that could be launched from an F-15 fighter and was very, very adept at taking things out. So in responding to a Russian start, the Americans did the thing much better, which then meant that, hang on a second, so you do have a system when you're starting to play, particularly with anti-satellite devices, that you get into an arms race. But as Frans pointed out, as soon as you start blowing people's satellites up, we already have a Kistler Syndrome in Earth orbit. A Kistler Syndrome is when you're getting enough collisions between debris and active satellites that if you do nothing, if you don't add anything, you still get a growth of particles and debris
Is that
created.
because they fragment?
Because fragments hit other fragments,
yeah.
And that process is already started in low Earth orbit, and we're at very high risk of it in geostationary orbit. And if you start anti-satelliting, in fact, the current Kistler Syndrome was in large part started by that Chinese test we've mentioned.
Okay, now both of you want to say
Yeah,
something.
I think there's a saying, right? The proof of the pudding is in the eating, and I think that holds true here as well. I mean, if this whole Space Force thing is just an administrative reshuffling with no additional budget, then it doesn't amount to anything new. And I believe that Congress has to step in order to approve the budget for any moving beyond the 20 billion. If that starts to happen, then gradually new things may arrive, but that's something still to be seen, I would say. And even then, if it's just to match the increased capabilities of others in space, it is an arms race. But it depends upon who takes the lead, forces the other to follow, right? Or whether you follow yourself and make it possibly make the opponents pay too high a price to try and stay in the lead, which is, of course, what happened 20 years ago with the arms race, because ultimately the Soviet Union collapsed because they couldn't afford it.
They couldn't afford it. Yeah, Sarah.
I was just going to pick up on the Kessler system, Kessler problem. I think we underestimate the problem of debris in space, actually, and if we don't resolve this, and I've been in many venture capital conferences in the US where they walk out when someone comes on to talk about what we do about space junk, because people sometimes don't want to know about it. But if we don't resolve this, that's devastating for the whole industry.
And I suppose, look, since we're talking about the militarization, there's always a danger that something will hit, let's say, an American satellite up there, affect American systems on the ground, and somebody will think it has been done deliberately when in fact it perhaps hasn't.
I think,
how's that to be avoided?
I think it's more easily detectable if it has, because we are tracking the debris which is in space.
We are tracking it. Yeah.
Well, it's already happened to AMC-9. AMC-9, if you look at the orbital mechanics, it must have been hit by an object that was 1/2 ton to 200 tons at car crash type speeds.
And what would that have been?
That's the worry. It didn't receive a collision warning, which means an object of that size wasn't tracked and the satellite wasn't given a warning that it was at risk. So the tracking in geostationary orbit is not perfect. The studies we've been doing suggest that some of the objects being tracked are misidentified. And so there is a danger of satellites, particularly more in geostationary orbit than low Earth orbit, being lost. And you don't know. I mean, 2 satellites were lost in 2017, one of which was AMC-9. The other one just seems to have exploded. And neither one is there any real establishment of what caused those losses.
Can I ask General Kimmit a question here? How confident are you that mistakes can be avoided? Because we talk about something here where a satellite's been destroyed. We talk about the Kistler effect. Kistler effect. It's a very real possibility that somebody who's a bit trigger happy here could think that somebody's attacking them when in fact it's just space debris that's the problem.
No, I think you're exactly right. I'm not confident that the probability is 0. certainly the probability is greater than 0. If we get beyond this notion, these inflammatory words such as space race, arms race, space force, and understand that we cannot stop this development.
How well protected then are US assets in space already?
Well, I certainly don't want to get into intelligence and sources and methods, but I would advocate as soon as possible we get beyond the current situation and get down to the hard work of conventions around the world, the way we did this for chemical weapons, the way we did this for nuclear weapons. The best assurance that we have of avoiding miscalculation is to put in place negotiated conventions that the world can live with to avoid any potential accident in space.
Thank you, General Kimmit. We're going to say goodbye to you officially now. I know you've disappeared into the ether a couple of times, but
Sure.
Your contribution much appreciated as ever. Frans, you're the lawyer. More conventions needed.
Sure.
Possible or not?
I'm all for it, and obviously if the great powers are in agreement, then anything can happen. I mean, don't forget that the Outer Space Treaty was arrived at the time when the Soviet Union at the time and the United States were in a Cold War. And yet they were able to agree on this Outer Space Treaty. So who knows? I'm always hopeful in that sense.
Is there any talk about people getting around the table and thrashing this out? Is it perhaps being done already?
Not so far at the level of governments, I think. But if you call upon the lawyers and say, well, let's sit down and draft a text which could probably make sense as a starting point, then hopefully something will arrive. Certainly if we have the support of people at the level of General Kimmit.
Yeah.
You know, that's...
Yeah, and Mark, you think this is vital as General Kimmit does as well? Something like this? We need something, a set of laws to govern what's going to happen militarily principally, but also commercially in space?
We do need clear improvements in space law. That is widely understood. And unfortunately, the Outer Space Act, in not appreciating where space was going, is somewhat ambiguously and often contradictorily worded. And the problem with international treaties is they take for absolute ever to do it.
Not the Outer Space Treaty, that was drafted within a year.
Yeah, but every conference I've sat through listening to lawyers going about how we change it, talk about decades.
Yeah, but that's when you have all the nations around the world sitting around the table. But if you would just confine it to the 3 or 4 or 5 big players and you would have a sort of similar understanding, then things can move. I mean, I share your general views, obviously, because that's the truth.
We haven't got very much more time because we want to hear from Terry Virts again towards the end of the programme.
I just wanted to add, I think if you want to make money, be a space lawyer, because this is a, you know, if you want to be the first space trillionaire, forget asteroid mining, forget manufacturing in space, it's legal, because this is a completely new industry, as we were saying in the programme before, and it's everything from regulation and legal work. We don't have the legal framework in place for things like this. It is going to grow organically. There's no point all coming together now and deciding these are the laws for space. There needs to be someone who steps back slightly. We've got the same thing with the FAA and commercial spaceflight out in America.
You've been a stargazer for years and years and years. Yeah. I'm going to ask you this just to round up the programme. Do you think we're going to see a military base belonging either to an international group of players, in other words, different countries together, or individual nations perhaps in opposition to one another at some time on the moon?
It's reducing.
The possibility is reducing.
In the early space age, both America and Russia were looking at manned space stations, and Russia got very close to launching one. As the robotics systems become better and better, the drive to put humans in space to carry out military activities drops. So I think it's very unlikely that a specific military installation will be installed for an awful long time. It will happen eventually, but it is a long time.
But right now, the mechanics are there on the Earth to make it possible to do what you want with material in the space directed back at Earth, or indeed at other interplanetary assets.
Yes, yes.
Well, listen, I've got to say thank you very much indeed. I've already thanked Mark Kimmit, Brigadier General Mark Kimmit, retired in Baghdad. Frans, thank you for coming in. And as Sarah just said, perhaps the next best paid profession is going to be a space lawyer. We'll have to take that. Mark Hempsell, thank you very much indeed. And Sarah, thank you very much. Listen, we've heard from 4 experts and interested parties here in the studio. We've heard from a former military man in Baghdad, and we heard at the beginning from Terry Virts, a man who's been commander of the International Space Station. So since he's been there, since he's seen it, we're going to end this program with these final thoughts from Terry Virts. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. See you at the next Roundtable.
I went into space thinking that I would learn about spaceships and planets and stuff, and I really learned about life on Earth. And when you look back, you can see things like global wealth at night. It's very powerful. And the most poignant examples of how humans live and treat each other on Earth was looking at North Korea and South Korea. You can see that border. It's a wall. There's lights, there's economy. You can tell that the nation of South Korea is going well. On the Chinese side, there's a lot of lights, there's a lot of activity there. And then North Korea is one giant black hole. And really, I went into space and could look back and see how politics on Earth are taking place, and really see how some people live in the light and some people live in the darkness.